Hello and welcome to a quick rundown on the 4 basic elements of a database. Let's go ahead. I already have the example file downloaded, so I'll just keep that there. In fact, I'll let it open real quick in the background so we can get to it. There it is, and I will set this aside for the moment. And now what we're going to do is identify the 4 basic elements of a database, and then we're going to talk about what each element is for and how it's built. So these elements are tables, forms, queries, and reports. Now these objects are kind of specific to the 2 main desktop database apps, that's basically LibreOffice Base or OpenOffice Base and Microsoft Access. So they kind of follow this 4 things. But any database program or any database software you're going to use is going to have, you're going to have to build things like this anyway. So let's look at a table. A table is the basic, most fundamental building block of a database. It's made up of columns and rows. Each column is called a field. So this is the terminology that we'll use for describing a table. And a row is usually called a record. So and moreover, unlike in a spreadsheet where each cell can kind of have whatever data type you want, in this, every column is restricted to a specific data type that you define when you create the table initially. And you can change them, but it's sometimes really messy, especially if you have a very large database. So every column is going to have a very specific data type. So in this particular table, we've got an ID column. So the ID field has some sort of numerical data type. All the rest of the ones in this table are text, what we call a varchar. It's kind of an archaic term, but that's what it is. We'll just call it a text field. Next is a form. Now, forms are basically a user interface that you can create to allow your users to modify or update the database or just browse it. The main purpose of this is, well, there's two main purposes. On the one hand, it makes it easier for your users to actually interact with the database because it's a nice user interface that you create, and the other thing that it does is it restricts their access to the actual table itself. The one thing you do not want is for anybody to actually manipulate records in the table itself. This is kind of a no-no in all database software. You do not want to, even yourself, even if it's you that created the database, you don't want to be mucking about in the database because mistakes can be made. And those mistakes can often cause some serious problems. So you create a form which gives you a much cleaner, more rational, focused user interface that only allows certain operations. So a query is sort of, when you create a query, you define a set of parameters to create a cross-section of your tables. And it outputs them to a table. So a query is like it's a way of searching the database for specific information. So in this example from the previous one, we have, this is from the veterinary clinic example, we have a query that just finds the contact information for each customer and then creates a calculated field which tells how many pets that person has with the system. So Jeff here doesn't have any. Maybe he's a new customer and we haven't defined any pets for him yet, or something like that. So they get output to a table, and this is what it looks like. Now, this obviously doesn't look super pretty, so one thing that you might do with a query is find a way to make it look nice by generating a report from that query. So what a report is it's a query that's been formatted for printing. Typically, that's typically how you do it. You create a query to get a specific subset of information, and then you build a report off of that. And a report is just something that's supposed to be human readable, and it looks nice. So this is what a report might look like based on this query here. So that's basically it for the 4 elements. They do kind of interact with each other in interesting ways. So here's kind of the relationship between these things. A table is the fundamental basic building block. The one thing that unifies all database software is that they're based on tables, or at least relational databases. There are other kinds of databases that are a little different, but we're not going to get into those. Forms are used to manipulate the data in tables, and then there's kind of a circular relationship between tables, queries, and reports. Queries are used to search tables and get a cross-section to search tables for specific data, and then reports are ways that we can take table data or query results and format them for printing. So this is kind of the basic relationship between these things. So that's the last slide. Let's look at our example toy database. So this is the veterinary example. We have in the table section 2 tables, and let's just look at them real quick. This is the customer table. It popped up on another one. So this is it. This is all the data that's in it. I have all these fields. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fields. 7 fields. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fields, and 5 records. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these are all of the it's like email, phone number, address. Let's take a look at this on the back end. Let's look behind it at its what we call a schema. So we have, these are the fields defined, and so we have our field names, we have our field types, and then occasionally we'll put a description in there. The description doesn't ever really show up anywhere. It's really just there as a reference, and right now I only put a description for the primary key. And we'll talk about primary keys and how keys work and what they're for as we move through this section of the course. It's basically how the database will build its index, and you can actually define your own indices. You can create your own indexes on there, but an index is basically just a way of quickly sorting and searching the database based on some value, in this case the ID number, which is guaranteed by the database software to be a unique value for each record. The rest of them are all text data, so name, phone number, address, city, state, zip, email. You can do stuff like define a format for things. Like you can say, I want to make sure that I want to validate. You can add basically validation to make sure that this is a correctly formatted phone number or a correctly formatted email address. But we're not going to go too deep into that, and it's not necessary for our purposes at this moment. What we're doing, because we're just trying to learn the basic fundamentals. So there's the schema, and here's the actual table. Let's take a look at the pet table. First, let's look at the schema. So this is we have an ID field, which is our primary key, and then here we have a name and a species. So the pet has a name and a species, and this is really just an example. You could probably add like the sex of the animal and things like that. You could add a number of different other fields here too, but this is a very simplified example. And then maybe most importantly, there's this one right here. Most interestingly, is we have an integer field, a number that is supposedly represents the owner, and this is what we call a foreign key. Now, if we look at our database relationships, now this is sort of the relationship between the two tables. We have a connection between the ID key field on the customer and the owner and the owner field on the pet. So these two things have to be connected in some way. So if we actually open up the pet table here, you'll notice that each record in this table has an ID number of its own, the name of the pet, the species of the pet, and then the owner of that pet, which is represented by an integer. And these integers are all in the customer table. So it'll be these numbers right here, and it has to be those numbers because of the way the database is defined. If it's not one of those numbers, then there will be an error. So let's take a look at a simple query. So let's look at it behind the scenes. So this is sort of how the query is designed. You add tables that you want the query to search, and then in this case we've added both of them to our search, and we'll walk through how to do all of this stuff in our in the tutorials. Then we have so we're taking from the customer table all these fields, all their contact information, and then having it group by those values. Now, maybe more interestingly is this one over here, which is doing a count function on the ID number of the number of pets, or on the ID number of pets. So this is basically going to count the number of pets that each owner has. So if we run this query, we end up with this. And here's where we see that Jeff does not have any pets. So let's actually try to change that. So if we go over here, and Jeff is ID number 3, if we add another pet in here, let's Scriffles, and this is an elephant, and its owner is number 3. So now if we go back to our query, where did it go? Here it is. And rerun the query now, you'll notice that the number of pets that Jeff has is 1. So this is a way that we can search and sort, and so this relatively simple query here gives us some pretty powerful tools. Now this doesn't look very nice. If I run this, or if I open the query just by itself, it gives me the query results, but it still looks like this spreadsheet looking thing. Down here in a report, we can take that same query. This report is basically built off of that query, and notice it opens it in a word processor, which is kind of interesting. So, and here we have, of course, all of our customers and the number of pets that they have. We could create a more sophisticated report that actually prints the number of pets. We could do a report for, like, okay, print off the report of everybody that, if we had like an invoices table that had some value in a field in there saying whether or not that invoice had been paid, then we could do something like run a report for all the invoices that haven't been paid so that you would know who to call. And I'll close this real quick. Last, let's look at this. We have one form here, which is just a customer form. So here's what it looks like. And you can make these things look as pretty as you want. You can add like logos and things like that. This one is very simple. The wizard creates these very, they actually look pretty old. They look like internet from the 90s. But I can navigate through the individual records. I could create a new one. So here's a new one. So maybe, let's do Albert Camus. And his phone number is 555-5555-123 My Street, Minneapolis, Minnesota. I don't know. 12345. And then that's now that record is saved in here. In fact, if I go back into that table, the customer table, let's close it and then reopen it. You'll notice that there's now a new entry in it. So the form is a much better way of navigating through these, through the various records. And you can make these, we're going to make more sophisticated, more interesting forms in the tutorials to come. So this is just kind of a basic example of it. And that's basically it. Those are the 4 main kind of fundamental database object types. Tables, queries, forms, and reports, and that's what we're going to build our database off of. So, hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you in the first tutorial.